Redeemer exists to help connect Jesus to people, people to community, and community to mission. Whoever you are, wherever you are, and whatever you're tuning in with, welcome to another Bible Talk in the Redeemer Queens Park community. I want to talk to you about that thing we all really want to be a part of, a healthy community. You know, one of those really healthy communities where people aren't really selfish, and they're not selfish in a variety of ways. It's one of those communities where people don't simply think of themselves less. They don't actually look down on themselves. They don't look down on other people. They're a different kind of sort. The kind of community where people don't think more of themselves. They also don't think less of themselves. They just think of themselves less. It's the community we really want to be a part of. And the Bible tells us that we actually have something in our hearts that prevents each and every one of us from being that kind of person in that kind of community. I want to share it with you just briefly, and it's from Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. It's from a guy named Paul, and Paul was writing a letter to one of the early churches, encouraging them with their own community dynamics. He highlights the problem of community. He gives them a picture of what a healthy community ought to look like, and then he points them to the person who can make that kind of community possible. Let's consider it all. It's in Philippians 2, 1 through 11. The first one is in verses 2 through 3, and it goes like this. It's the problem with our hearts. The problem with our hearts. You can see the words on the screen right here, verses 2 to 3. We see the real problem with our hearts, and the problem comes down to pride. Yeah, we hear this word pride and we want to bristle, but we know it's true. Paul is warning the people here. He's encouraging them. Listen, be careful with that ambition. Be careful with that rivalry. Be careful with that conceit, because it can be the very thing that destroys community. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. And this word is kindoxis. Kindoxis. It's the combination of two Greek words. The first one is kino, which means to empty yourself, and doxis means to be hungry for honor, respect, or assurance. Paul says the real problem with communities is the problem of our hearts. It's that our hearts are made for glory. We're made to live in the presence of God, to enjoy God, to have a relationship with God, and to rule the world out of relationship with God. And tragically, when we don't have that relationship with God as the anchor point, as the ballast at the bottom of our lives to keep us upright, we are going to try to find that glory in other places. The problem with finding glory in other places is not only that it doesn't satisfy, but it means a mess for community. When we don't have God and His glory at the center of our lives, we are on to the real problem with our hearts and the problem for community. We're going to have ambition because we're going to look to other people, and the only way we're going to be able to measure our performance if we don't have God in our lives is to measure our performance by how well we're doing in comparison to other people. Am I living a better life? Am I living a worse life? How are my kids performing? How are their kids performing? How much am I earning? How much are they earning? These are the questions that will begin to consume us as we engage in rivalry with one another. So then when we even get around each other for have dinner, hang out at lates, we're not really even concerned for how well things are actually going in our hearts. If we're not careful, all we're doing is just measuring our own progress, how well we're doing and how well we're performing. It's not a problem for people out there. It's a problem for people like me, and the problem is right in here. Well, remember, this was a letter written to the church, written to the church in Philippi, one of the healthiest churches in all of the Bible. And if they could struggle with this, then how much more can I struggle with this? And we struggle with this as well. Listen, the problem with community is the problem of our hearts. It's that we have pride. It's that we are going to find our identity in how well we perform against one another. Well, if that's the real problem of community, if pride is this sickness that is caused by an absence of glory in our hearts, then what would health look like? Well, Paul very graciously provides for us this picture of a healthy community. As you can see it right here in verses 3 through 4, look at the standard. Look at this picture of a healthy community. And I want you to notice one word right in the middle of it all, and it's this word, humility. You see it in verse 3, humility. Let's address the growing concern. Some of us think about this and we think, wait a minute, are you going to talk about humility? I mean, are you even really qualified, Thomas? Thankfully, we're not talking about my measure of humility. We're talking about the humility of Jesus here. I probably don't have a whole lot that I actually am humble about compared to the amount of things in my life that I should actually be humble about, but you can relax. We're not talking about my humility. We're talking about the humility of Jesus. Humility is unique. Humility is important. And humility means to be gentle, modest, or deferential. Now, what's fascinating is that outside the Bible, whenever this Greek word was used, it was always used in a derogatory way. Humility was the language of the slave. Social stability was based on fear. Yet the Bible has the audacity to use this word 270 times that was always used negatively in its cultural context. Yet the Bible prizes this word and esteems this word ahead of all the other virtues, associating this word to Christ. Go back and read the Greek philosophers and you won't find mention of this word once in a way that's encouraging or helpful. So when Jesus was meek, when Jesus was low, what was this humility that was in his life? See, the best way to understand humility isn't even to look directly at it. We have to compare it against something else. So consider what humility is by considering what pride is. John Stott says pride is our greatest enemy, but the truth of the matter is humility is our greatest friend. Pride gives us a tendency to compare ourselves to other people, usually those who perceive themselves to be inferior to us in many regards, such as their appearance, intelligence, success, and on and on. Yet humility is comparing yourself to Jesus. In every instance, you look at him and you realize you missed the mark and you have a lot to be grateful for. You see, pride covets another person's success, and why we critique people when they succeed is that we have pride in our hearts and we just wish they weren't succeeding how they are. Yet humility gives us motivation to rejoice in the success of other people. Ultimately, pride is about me and humility is about another. When you think about it all the way down, pride is an insecurity that shows up in feelings of superiority and inferiority. And humility is not being high and looking down on others, and at the same time, it's not being down on yourself and beating yourself up. Pride leads to arrogance, smugness, and is repugnant to be around, and humility leads to confidence. You say, I won't deny convictions, I won't disagree with Scripture, I won't dishonor Jesus. Not arrogance, but confidence, and there's a difference between the two. Augustine said, pride is the mother of all other sins. Pride is pregnant with all sorts of other sins, yet humility is the mother of all joy. She shows up pregnant to the party with all the other virtues within, ready to freely give them out. Look to the interest of others is what Paul says. Paul says don't hate yourself. He also does not say don't have any cares, concerns, or goals. Paul says humility is what you're really looking for. True humility is not thinking more of yourself. It's also not thinking less of yourself. It's just thinking of yourself less. Now here's the real question. How do we get there? Humility is about what you're looking at. What is it that you're looking at? Are you really looking at yourself? Are you considering your own performance? Are you looking at your family? You're making your identity out of that? We are always thinking about ourselves. That is the great problem with our lives. Yet the great solution is humility. It's looking away from the interest of ourselves, looking after the interest of other people. So if that's the problem of our hearts, and if that's the picture of what it takes to have a beautiful community, we're going to need something. We are going to need this person who can make us whole, and of course his name is Jesus. You can learn about him in verses 5 through 11 as they scroll on the screen here. This is a hymn. This is a hymn. This is a song of praise to the greatness of Jesus. Paul is talking about humility. He's talking about the great problem in the church. It's that people are going to become conceited with pride. They're going to have ambitions and try to run past one another. And yet he breaks out into this theological song. Our question ought to be why? And the answer is that you can't work on humility directly. It's not enough for Paul to look at us and say, you know what, the problem is pride, the solution is humility, go have fun with that. Paul has to do something more. He has to do something better. He has to give us a portrait of Jesus. And in staring at this portrait of Jesus, it's the only thing that can come into the hardness of our hearts and to unlock our pride and to engender humility once and for all. See, even thinking about the concept of humility actually leads you to grow in pride, because then you become the kind of person that's just thinking how I'm more humble than other people. What we actually need is Jesus. Consider this beautiful portrait of Jesus. Just get lost in this portrait of Jesus. Have a look at this one. Have a look at what God has offered through Jesus to us in the midst of our pride and self-centeredness. Philippians 2, 5 through 11, it is a symphony in 3 movements Notice the first movement, the incarnation. Look at verses 6 and 7. Even though Jesus had the divine nature, he chose to make himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Paul doesn't say that Jesus shed his nature as God, but rather he assumed a human nature. Jesus was both fully divine and fully human at the same time. Let's move into Act 2 of the symphony, and we see the atonement in verse 8. Jesus did not simply humble himself into being a man, but he humbled himself to a particular task, to be obedient to death, even death on a cross. Despite the fact that Jesus did retain a divine nature on earth, he voluntarily chose not to exercise all of his rights to them. Instead, he chose to become weak. He chose to become vulnerable, and he chose to die on an old Roman cross. In Act 3 of the symphony is where we see Jesus' great reward for this life of humility. In verses 9 through 11, we see God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name. And one day, each and every one of our knees will bow before him, some in humble and loving worship, and others out of force as we recognize him as the true King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Jesus' life was marked not by just one, but two self-humblings in the incarnation and on the cross. And he is exalted. He is exalted by God for this humbling work. The key to it all is verse 7 and this Greek word kenosis. Though he was God, he emptied himself, but he emptied himself of what? Did he empty himself of his divinity? The text doesn't say that. He emptied himself of his glory. Think about this with me. This is what we need in our own glory-hungry lives. We need the glory of this one who did not consider the position of his own glory to be a power play opportunity, to where he could have mastery over other people. He saw his privileges and his benefits as the Son of God as an opportunity to lift other people up. He emptied himself of his glory, not of his deity. Glory was his beauty or his brightness. When you see something that is glorious, it evokes adoration. Isaiah 53 tells us he had no beauty that we should desire him, and he set that aside. That would evoke honor. So he emptied himself of his glory. He became a small one and not a king at all. He became beatable and he was beaten. He became rejectable and he was rejected. And this was all him giving his glory away to us, those that are desperately hungry for glory. So when you think about it, the way to true community, the way of flourishing, is actually an upside down sort of way. It's going to work absolutely against the economy and values of this world at every single pass. Jesus provides this way. The way up is indeed going down. The way to be rich in the kingdom is to give it away. The way to rule is actually to serve. And the way to become infinitely happy is not to seek your happiness at all, but to look after the happiness of other people. The way to finding glory is to give your glory away for other people. Notice the futility of our striving. If we'd only look to Jesus and allow him giving his glory away to our very glory-hungry lives to satisfy us, then we become the kind of people that we really desire to be like and around in healthy community. Jesus Christ had true glory, and he emptied himself of his glory so that we can have glory. The only way to find glory is to give yourself in the service of other people. And this is exactly what all of us are hungry for in healthy community. We're hungry to be around the kind of place where people don't think more of themselves, where people don't think less of themselves, but they simply think of themselves less. That's just the kind of community that Redeemer aspires to be, looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.